Those of you gathered here today, I would like to welcome you to the 2022-2023 colloquium sponsored by the Donald Blake Center here at Walla Walla University. You are an awesome group of people, young people on the path to making life better for someone else, and we're glad you've come to participate. In 1962, 60 years ago, I joined the faculty of Walla Walla College. My experiences were a kaleidoscope of experiences, far many more better than negative. But out of it came an opportunity to spread the word that, as God has said, we are all God's children and we're all created equal. So take your time and enjoy the session.
Would you please bow your heads with me in prayer? Dear Lord, thank you for bringing us together this morning in this place. Please be with our speakers today. Help us receive your message and go with us for the rest of the week. Help us learn. Thank you.
I feel honored to get to introduce you all today to the very cool professor, scholar, and renowned author, Shawn Wong. So last quarter, while I was scrambling for lesson plan materials, I came across this excellent work, My Saving Grace, i.e. an anthology of Asian American writers. And what I hadn't realized was that I had come across a landmark anthology of Asian American literature that Shawn Wong was an editor of. So in addition to this seminal work, he is also the editor and co-editor of 6 anthologies of Asian American and American multicultural literature. He's also contributed to this body of literature himself with 2 novels, Home Base and American Needs, the latter of which has been adapted into an award-winning feature film. He is currently a professor of English and the Byron and Alice Lockwood Professor in Humanities at the University of Washington, where he has also been the director of the Creative Writing Program, the chair of the Department of English, and the director of the University Honors Program. Through his work, Shawn Wong has invaluably contributed to spreading recognition of both Asian American authors and the ideas that they share through their literature. We are incredibly grateful to get to hear him share with us today as he continues this important work here at our own university. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Shawn Wong.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for coming today and for inviting me. It's a little odd to invite a guest speaker who's a professor when you're all already in college. So I hope it'll be a slightly entertaining and a little bit different. The subject of my talk today is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what I have up here on the screen right now is a statement, a resolution by the University of Washington. I won't read through the whole thing. You can read it for yourself. But essentially what happened at the University of Washington is that hiring and promotion and tenure are normally based on 3 things, which is teaching, research, and service. Professors, for example, move up on the pay scale according to those 3 areas. And so a resolution was proposed recently to add a 4th category, which is a DEI statement, or diversity, equity, and inclusion statement, that each professor would have to write at the end of each year in order to be considered for merit increases in their salary. The one thing to note is that the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion are one of the core values of the University of Washington. And so the idea of adding a fourth category to evaluate professors seemed to be in line not only with the stated core values of the University of Washington, and it seemed to make sense because it also followed what was called the diversity blueprint for the University of Washington. The interesting thing about a resolution, it has to be voted on by the faculty, and the resolution failed. So much for faculty being in line with the core values of diversity at the University of Washington. And so when it failed, I thought to myself, well, this is interesting. Maybe my colleagues don't know how to write a diversity, equity, and inclusion statement. And so I thought, I'll help them and see what happens. No one asked me to help them, but I just thought, maybe I can help them. But before we get to that, I also wanted to say that I have been, I'm not a stranger to Walla Walla. For 5 years, I've been coming here as part of a project called the Red Badge Project, teaching a storytelling workshop to veterans at the local library in Walla Walla, and together with several other teachers. One of them is Tom Skerritt, a famous actor. And for those of you younger people who don't know Tom Skerritt, he was in Alien, and he was in Top Gun. So we started a workshop here for veterans, particularly those who are trying to recover from post-traumatic stress disorder, things like that. And we started the project about 9 years ago at Joint Base Lewis McChord, and it's been quite successful. But I've been, over that 5-year period, I was coming to Walla Walla every 3 months, and I got to know your city really well. And one of the things I think that I use in this, I learned from those workshops is that I had a little exercise that I started with every first day of the workshop. Because when you stand in front of the classroom, you often look out there and you may think at first that you don't have anything in common with the people in your classroom, or in this case, the audience here. And so I have this little exercise that I conduct with the veterans, which we will do here. So DEI begins with sharing stories. I'm a novelist, so most of my talk today is actually in the form of a story. Finding common experience. While we might look different from one another, seated in the classroom, we're connected by stories. So I'm going to find out. So one of the assignments that I give the veterans is, how many different jobs have you had before the age of 25? And a lot of my peers of my age, we often worked a lot as kids and teenagers. And so what I would like to do here with you guys is I'm going to read a list of all the jobs that I had before the age of 25. And I want you to raise your hand if you've worked at any of these jobs. And then just keep your hands raised as I make my way through 16 different jobs that I had before the age of 25. So remember, raise your hand if you've ever done any of these. Babysitter. I made 50 cents an hour. Newspaper delivery boy. They used to deliver newspapers to your door. Swimming instructor, lifeguard, florist, delivery driver, gas station attendant, summer camp kitchen helper, park gift shop clerk, toy store clerk, writing tutor, ski lift operator, waiter, gardener, dishwasher, bartender, teacher. What do we got out there in terms of hands raised? So you see, we have a lot in common, you know? We can share stories. I remember in one of my workshops with the veterans, I had a group of 12 of us there, and it turned out that 4 of us had worked in a flower shop. And I remember the veterans who knew each other for years and years and years were pointing at each other, "You worked in a flower shop?" And so we started to share stories about our common adventures. And I think that's where diversity, equity, and inclusion starts, you know, our shared common ground. I also have just spent 50 years teaching. I started my first teaching job 50 years ago in 1972 at Mills College, which is a private women's college. I was still in graduate school when I was hired there. And these are the universities and schools that I taught at before I came to the University of Washington in 1984. So I've been at the University of Washington for 38 years now. And this is the sort of full range of my teaching experience. But what I wanted to tell you is that I essentially became a professor by accident. I didn't intend to be a professor at all. I was supposed to be a writer, and you know what that means. That means you're a waiter, a barista, a cab driver, you know, the kinds of jobs artists take. And so when I was an undergraduate student at Berkeley, and I was an undergraduate student at Berkeley, and I decided when I was 19 that I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be a novelist. And then the day that I realized that, I also realized that I was the only Asian American writer I knew in the entire world. No teacher, either in high school or in college, had ever assigned a book by an Asian American writer. Never even mentioned the name of an Asian American writer. Right? And I knew there was a whole literary history of African American writing, and I figured there must be an equivalent literary history of Asian American authors. I'm Chinese American, and at that time, in the late 60s, you know, Chinese had been in America for 150 years. So I went to my American literature professor, and I said, "I'd like to read Asian American literature. What can I read?" And he said to me, "There isn't any." And I looked at him, and I thought to myself, that can't be. You know, we built the Transcontinental Railroad in the 19th century. Somebody wrote a poem somewhere, right? Somebody wrote a story. You know, we were not silent. And so I decided to major in Asian American literature, even though there were no teachers, there were no classes, you know, Asian American studies hadn't started at Berkeley yet. There were no credit, no grades, nothing. And so Asian American writers were not hard to find. You needed something called a library card in order to find them. And I don't think the American literature professor realized that you could find them with a library card. And so I started to find them, and I ended up teaching myself that subject. And my first job at Mills College, they had just started an ethnic studies department in 1972, and I was interviewed by the dean of the faculty, even though I had no graduate degree yet, I had no teaching experience, and I had no publications. You know, I was an aspiring novelist. Well, you have to write a novel in order to be a novelist. And so the dean of faculty interviewed me, said, "What can you teach?" And I said, "I can teach a class in Asian American literature." And she said, "Okay, you're hired." I didn't know getting jobs in academia were that simple. She did not know what that subject was, and so I tried to explain it to her. And she hired me. At the time, I was working as a gardener, and she offered me $1,400 to teach a class for a semester. It turned out to be $100 a week. And I told her that I was making $1,600 as a gardener in Marin County, which was a job I really loved. Who doesn't love a job like going around watering flowers in Marin County? And so, even though I didn't have any teaching experience, I made her match the dollar figure of my gardening job. And she did. And she said, "Okay, I'll give you $1,600. And I started my teaching career teaching a subject that I taught myself. And I'll get back to that in a second here. So I'm going to tell you a couple of other little stories. And this comes from, I think, my experience with this idea of DEI is now recently finding its way not only into classrooms and universities, but into boardrooms. And many years ago, I was invited by an executive at an unnamed insurance company. I won't mention their name, but they once sponsored a baseball field in Seattle. And this executive at the unnamed insurance company had invited me to the executive lunchroom to talk about the Seattle public art scene. I was the chair of the Seattle Arts Commission, and so they had this huge corporate art collection in their headquarters. And as we were walking to the lunchroom, I was identifying all the Northwest artists that they had collected. We're walking down the hallway, and I go, "Oh, you have a Mark Tobey." And he would walk over to the wall, and he would look at the little card, and he goes, "You're right." And then we'd walk by another, and I'd say, "Oh, you have a Patty Warashina sculpture." And he'd walk over and look at the card, and he goes, "Oh, you're right." And I said, "And you have a Paul Horiuchi over there." And he'd walk over, and he goes, "How do you know all of these? You've never been in our building before." And I said, "How do you not know them? You walk by them every day." Right? Their art collection was more diverse than their employees. And so I was sitting there, and we're having this nice lunch, and we're talking about the Seattle public art scene. That's why I was there, to share my expertise. And he suddenly stops and says to me, "How long have you been in this country?" And I look at him, and I think to myself, "What? Where did this come from? I just want to eat my lunch and talk about art. Now we have to talk about how long I've been in this country?" And so, since I was born in California, I told him my exact age at the time. I think at that time I was 54. So I said to him, been here 54 years. But he didn't get the joke. And he said, he took the other foot and put it in his mouth. And he said, no wonder I don't hear an accent in your voice. And I go, oh boy. And there's a little voice in your head at this moment in which you say to yourself, okay, do I call him? We're in church, so I'm not going to say what I was going to call him. Do I say something? Do I educate him or not? And I decided I'm just going to let it go because it's just not worth it. But, lunch is over. But the funny thing is, we Asian people love revenge. We really get into it, If you've ever seen any Korean soap operas, you know what I'm talking about. Anybody who's watched, what's this show, The Glory? Yeah, we know what revenge is. And so one day, the Seattle Times op-ed editors called me, and they said, we'd like you to write the annual Martin Luther King Day editorial for the newspaper. And I said, okay. And so in my op-ed piece for the Seattle Times, I talked about my lunch meeting with this unnamed insurance company executive. The next day, I'm sitting in my office at the University of Washington, and I get a call. And she identifies herself, and she says, I'm the head of diversity for Safeco Insurance. And just between us here. And she says, I read your article, and I'm quite concerned. And I said, oh, and she says, what was his name? And I go, I really can't remember. It was a long time ago. And but I talked about this little meeting, and she says to me, do you ever do public speaking about diversity? And I said, yes, I do. And she says, what's your fee? And I said, what's my fee? So I thought of the largest figure in my head, which was not very large, but I said $500 an hour. And she said, can I buy 4 hours of your time? I said, yes, you may. And she had me come and give a talk about diversity and Asian American to Safeco Insurance. So we find a way, I found a way to have my say in the end. But getting back to our subject here, I ended up at UC Berkeley, as you know. These are a picture of my parents, who were both Chinese immigrants, came over to the U.S. as students at Berkeley, and I was born in Berkeley. My father was a graduate student in civil engineering at Berkeley, and my mother was an art student. And I think really the idea of writing a DEI statement is just telling your story, telling a story about your diverse background or how you learned things from your parents, And I wanted to be a writer so that I could tell their story. My parents died quite young, and so I felt that it was my responsibility to tell their story, which was why I wanted to become a writer. And here's a picture of me writing in the 1970s. I looked like a very serious writer. I got the long hair. I got the wire rim glasses and a typewriter, in case you didn't know what that was, that I was using there. And so I decided to write a novel and become a novelist. My professors, I found this cartoon, and the reason I went into the field of Asian American literature is because at the University of California at Berkeley, we did not exist. Asian American literature did not exist. And so my professors were essentially saying, you do not belong in the canon of American literature. And I decided to prove them wrong. And so what happened was I met, as I mentioned before, when I said I was the only Asian American writer I knew in the world, that was true. I didn't even know any young Asian American wannabe writers. I think at the time in Berkeley, there were 1,100 English majors, and I was the only Asian student who was an English major at that time. And I went to Berkeley at a time when Asian students were an underrepresented minority, which is hard to believe at Berkeley today, where Asian American students account for almost 50% of the student body. But when I went to school at Berkeley, our population was only 6% of the student body. In fact, I got into Berkeley as an underrepresented minority. They recruited me and gave me a scholarship to pay for the $90 a quarter tuition. I know, I can hear the air being sucked out of the room right now. By the time I graduated, the tuition had gone up to $160 a quarter, so I knew it was time to leave. But I did meet 3 other young Asian American writers who are pictured here. Lawsony Nada, that's me on the left, the right there, and Lawsony Nada's next to me, and next to him is Jeff Chan, and down below is Frank Chin. And what we decided to do was we edited the very first anthology of Asian American literature, the first trade volume of Asian American literature. And we completed the manuscript when I was a senior undergraduate at Berkeley. I did not know that undergraduates aren't supposed to, publish anthologies or define a canon of American literature that wasn't recognized yet. And so we set out. Lawson and Frank and Jeff were a little bit older than I was, and they were already, out of college, and I was the only one still in college. We set out to find a publisher. And of course, all the big commercial publishers rejected us. We went to Random House, we went to Doubleday. Many of the publishers turned us down. Some turned us down with insulting remarks. I remember we went to lunch with an editor at Doubleday in New York City, and he said to us, I read your manuscript, but the least ethnic pieces were the best. And I thought, what does that mean? I was like 20 years old, and I remember looking at him. We were sitting at this very exclusive private club that editors belong to. It's a quite famous club called the Century Club. It was all male, not anymore, but it was all male. All the waiters were black, and I was like sitting there. This is not real comfortable sitting here, but he was saying that our anthology should just really be case histories of what it's like to live in an Asian community and to drop the idea that of including stories that had artistic merit or literary devices, things like that. He only saw our story as social history and not art. And so we bounced around, the manuscript bounced around for several years until finally Howard University Press has just started publishing, a publishing company. Howard University Press, of course, is connected to Howard University, the black university in Washington, D.C. And they wanted our book to be one of the first 10 books that they published in their inaugural year as a university press. And our book was the only non-African American book on their list. And the book came out, and it came out to great acclaim because there were no Asian American literary anthologies out there. And so everybody reviewed it. It came out in 1974. The New York Times reviewed it. The New Yorker reviewed it. We were even in the Rolling Stone. And so as a 20-something-year-old, to see your book in the Rolling Stone, forget about the New Yorker. The Rolling Stone was it. And so I also remember the New Yorker magazine fact checker calling me early one morning. And she said, "I'm so-and-so from New Yorker magazine, and I'm a fact checker, and we're running an essay about your anthology." And I was on the phone, and I said, "Who is this?" And she goes, "This is the New Yorker." I said, "Oh yeah, sure it is." You know, I'm new at this. And she goes, "You could call me back if you'd like." And I go, "This is really the New Yorker?" And she goes, "Yes." And I said, "Okay, what do you want to know?" So, and then many years later, this is actually a picture just a few years ago from the New Yorker magazine, in which the article credits us for naming the Asian American literary canon. And so I think the important thing about this story is that the university, in this case UC Berkeley, was not giving a student what they wanted to learn, right? And the lesson is sometimes you have to go out there and find it yourself. You know, you have to be your own teacher, right? And that's what I did. And so I always called myself, I said, you know, I'm not really a literary scholar. I've always been a literary activist, right? And so I just took that activist sort of sense of self into the ivory tower. And I said, you have to essentially, before the words diversity, equity, and inclusion were invented, what I was trying to do as a young undergraduate was to change academia so that it was more responsive to the things that I wanted to learn. Funny story about my first job at Mills College. I had a class of, as I mentioned, it's a private women's college. I was 22 at the time, and I had a class of 8 students, 8 young women. And I looked at the semester system, and it was 14 weeks long. And at that time, our anthology identified 14 different authors who made up Asian American literature. And so I thought to myself, my job is to teach everything I know about Asian American literature to my students, and then I would be out of a job. And so I assigned all 14 books to my students. You would think I had never gone to college at all, and that 14 books over a 14-week semester would be too many books. And the interesting thing is my students never complained. They read all 14 books. I started to complain that it was too much, even though I had read all the books already. They were a great group of students. Some of them still keep in touch with me. They're all retired now. I don't know why I'm still working, but it was a great place for me to start teaching. So I also the anthology was recently published by the University of Washington in a new edition to celebrate its 45th anniversary. So it's available for purchase. So if you're interested in the history of the anthology, there's a new edition now. This is where I'm trying to sell you my book. Amazon.com, and I think in your university bookstore. Yes. So, and part of literary activism was also trying to get a lot of the books that were out of print that I discovered in my search for them as an undergraduate back into print. And so this essay in the New Yorker recently talks about our story of trying to get some of these books back into print. And one of them was No-No Boy by John Okada. A story about, often credited as one of Japanese America's first novels. No-No Boy is a story about a young Seattle Japanese American who comes back to Seattle after World War II, after being incarcerated in Japanese American concentration camp, and then later in prison for resisting the draft during World War II. And so it details his story of trying to fit back into Seattle's Japanese American community as well as mainstream community in Seattle. It's a great novel, and it went out of print in the 70s, and so it was originally published in 1956, and I wanted to get publishers to republish it, and nobody would. Until finally I went to the, I was living in the Bay Area then, and I went to the University of Washington Press, and I said, you know, this story takes place in Seattle. It would be the perfect book for your publishing company. And the University of Washington Press turned me down. And being young and not really understanding rejection as a writer, I wrote back to them, and I said, I need you to reconsider. And they said, okay, we'll publish it if you give us $5,000. I don't have $5,000, right? And I said, that's ridiculous. And so my friends and I, Frank, Jeff, and Lawson, we decided, we're not business people. Let's give ourselves $5,000 and publish it ourselves and tell the University of Washington Press to go themselves. I'm really intimidated by being here. So there's so what happens is we got our friend to design the book, a graphic designer named Bob Onodera, and he designed the inside of the book for us too. He worked for an advertising firm. And then the printer requires that you put 50% down, and then when it comes off the press, you owe another 50%. And I believe it cost $3,000 at that time. And we had $1,500, but we didn't have the other $1,500. So being really smart business people, we went to press with the $1,500, not understanding where we would find the other $1,500. And so while I was at the printers, we contacted the Japanese American national newspaper, the Pacific Citizen, and we asked one of the columnists, I said, I can't afford an ad, but can you just mention in your column that we're republishing No No Boy, and that if anybody sends a check for $3.95, I will send them a copy, prepaid, $3.95. They can be the first on the list to receive a copy of the book. And we went into a printing of 3,000 copies. And by the time the book came off the press, I had sold the entire printing by mail. Japanese America, almost all of Japanese America had heard of this novel. Nobody read it. Nobody read it. Its first printing was printed by Charles Tuttle in 1957 in an edition of 1,500 copies, and it had not sold out by the 1970s. So when the notice went out, I started to receive checks at home. I put my home address, and people started sending me checks. And it was almost to all Japanese American households. And the book came off the press. I unfortunately had to mail all the copies out by myself, stamp them and mail them during Christmas time in 1976. And we had enough money to go into a second printing, and I sold these books out of the trunk of my 1966 Mustang pictured here. We went into a second printing. I moved to Seattle and brought the books with me. And the interesting thing is, after the success of the book, I eventually turned over the book to the University of Washington Press. And I said, you can publish it now. And just to update you, they have sold over 180,000 copies of the book. So its time had come. The author, John Okada, never lived to see his book being recognized and lauded. And so when I say that I was a literary activist, this is the kinds of things that I was doing. I was trying to restore our literary history so that I could educate an audience to Asian American literature. I've recently started my own book series at the University of Washington, and I've been concentrating on publishing books that have been out of print, like No No Boy. This is Eat a Bowl of Tea by Louis Chu, and it is a novel about New York's Chinatown that was published in 1961. It was made into a movie in the 1980s. The other book is Janice Mirakatani's a well-known Japanese-American poet from the 1970s and 80s. These are two of her books that have two of her collections of poetry published in one volume that were both out of print. And so what I'm trying to do is restore Asian American literary history. We published a brand new book called Uncle Rico's Encore, mostly true stories of Filipino Seattle, by Peter Bacho. And this fall we're bringing out a Korean American novel by pioneering novelist Willis Kim, also a book that's gone out of print, called Dancer Dawkins and the California Kid. And so I think my message to you is a couple of things. One, how to share our stories so that we find our common ground. And also, if you don't find that your education is responding to your needs, go out and find it. Find what it is that is not being taught to you, and make your institution respond to you. And that's how That's how I found my career. And I still teach a subject that essentially I taught to myself. So anyway, I know I'm standing between you and free pizza, and that's a lot of pressure on me. And so I'm going to wind things up here. If you have questions, I understand that you can ask those questions where all the food is, and I'm happy to answer questions later. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Come on, give a big hand here. Oh, wonderful. To Professor Young. Before we have our closing prayer, there's a QR code up there that you can get his books, and they are also in the bookstore. And I think this is a wonderful. I just want to thank the organizers, especially Professor Dr. Cheris Current of the Blake Center, for putting all this together. Tonight, there's a question and answer right after this down in the fellowship hall. And I'm going to invite you to come and engage Professor Wong. Tonight, the Blake Center Conference continues in the WEC 209. Frank Abe will be there about his graphic novel, We Hereby Refuse, about Japanese internment. And then tomorrow at noon, Susan Monahan will be in the WEC 209 about Chinese domestic workers in Walla Walla. Let's pray. We thank you, God, for the message, for the inspiration. Now guide us and bless us and help us to go forth and work for you and turn this world upside down. In Jesus' name, amen.
Yeah.